In this third month of reading Augustine's City of God, we turn to books 8 through 10 as we wrap up the first part of the work where he responds to criticisms of Christianity. Augustine moves from addressing what he calls the fabulous gods of the theater and the civil gods of the city to address the philosophical or natural theologies of the philosophers. In particular, the Platonists or Neoplatonists, who are going to be so significant in his particular time period, the early 5th century. What we observe here is that in many ways Augustine acknowledges that here you have a more helpful witness. Here you have gods who commend not just the pursuit of earthly good, of material wealth or of military strength, but of some kind of happiness on the far side of death, some kind of life after death, some kind of eternality. Now, Augustine doesn't think they provide a way or a path there. Augustine is really going to challenge them for failing to offer a realistic account of what we'd call mediation, someone who actually connects God to humanity and humanity to God. But Augustine does acknowledge here we have figures who realize we're made not just to amass wealth, not just to make a name for ourselves, not just to dominate or conquer others. No, we're made for God. We're made for a greater life than this world can give. And so Augustine wants to acknowledge that benefit while also noting the limits of these various philosophers. As we look here, we can see that there's something about Augustine's approach to opposition that's worth reflecting on and catching. Augustine really suggests a number of steps that any Christian has to ponder as they think about various opposing philosophies or ideologies. First, you need to identify the myth that's being sold, whether it's the myth of manifest destiny or the American dream, the notion that you can do it yourself, the idea of exercising unbounded freedom. It could be many different things. Whatever the myth is, Augustine wants to point out that secondly, we need to ask, what's the complicating data? What are the facts that show the myth just isn't so? The ideal, it doesn't really prove to actually deliver on the goods. But that's only half the battle. Augustine then wants to ask, if there's complicating data, how is it that Romans, how is it that people around us continue to buy into the myth? And so he suggests we have to ask two more questions. First, we've got to ask, what are the practices, the social or communal practices whereby the myth is transferred from one to another, from one person to another, or one generation to another? Why do people still continue to believe and perpetuate certain notions about happiness or freedom or the good life, even when there are lots of examples that show that they don't work out? Well, Augustine argues there are rituals, there are practices, there are various rhythms of life that deeply ingrain those beliefs in us. Lastly, Augustine says we've got to ask, what are the medium-term benefits that those myths deliver? Where do we get a dopamine hit, as it were, from believing in and participating in those myths and rituals? What's their payoff socially? We need to be very alert to that because there are reasons that people buy into certain notions of patriotism, certain notions of materialism or consumerism, certain notions of transcendence and individualism. They pay off emotionally, socially, intellectually, materially. We need to realize what's actually motivating, what's providing that kind of hit as people participate in and go further in their direction. Pastorally, we can't respond unless we realize what's drawing people in different directions. Augustine here models this notion of immanent critique, patiently understanding opposing philosophies, ideologies, rituals, and habits, understanding how they work, understanding how they draw us in psychologically and socially, and then trying to assess whether or not they're valid, whether or not they're true, whether or not they deliver on the goods, whether or not their objections and criticisms of Christianity in its orthodox form are actually compelling. And Augustine presents us with a really fulsome, textured response to the most pertinent examples in his day. And so as we wrap up This first part of the city of God, it's pertinent for each of us to be asking, not of a world out there, but of the threats and temptations close in our neighborhood, in our church, in our own lives. Where are the voices? Where are the rituals? Where are the practices that we are bombarded with? What do they deliver? What do they promise? Where do we find that there are medium or short-term benefits that we delight in? How can we be more alert and attentive to those things? And in what ways do we find that Christianity challenges them? Augustine will bring Christian doctrine to bear on this. He will contradict these Roman arguments. He suggests that their view of God, whom we're made for, is still far too small. God is not ultimately and radically divinely transcendent. And that's a problem. God is far too much like us for those Platonists. And so we're going to observe that he's going to have to turn to an account of God and the way we're made for God and the way we experience mediation or relationship with God through Christ, who is the way, that actually promises happiness. One last comment to help you as you read along. We've read in a previous year Augustine's Confessions, perhaps his most read work and perhaps the most read Christian work beyond the Bible and the Pilgrim's Progress. In that book, you'll remember he tells the story of his searching after happiness through sex and money, through achievement and morality, through intellectual and philosophical growth. And in each case, he found himself achieving something, delighting in something, and then growing tired and frustrated by something. In many respects, it's a narrative version of Ecclesiastes. Sin delivers for a season, but then it proves stale. And so under the sun, there is no ultimate delight. Everything is vanity. It seems so real and promising, but it dissipates like a fog. City of God, books 1 to 10, in many respects parallels Confessions, books 1 through 9. Except here it's the story not of one man's pursuit of happiness in different ways, but of a city or a society's pursuit of happiness. Looking to military conquest, looking to economic and material prosperity, looking to leaving a name and a legacy for generations to come, looking ultimately even to the philosophical life of preparing for some kind of afterlife, some kind of union with the gods. But in each case, Augustine shows that while it delivers for a while and satisfies for a season, it doesn't deliver in the end. And ultimately, finally, we're called, like Ecclesiastes tells us at its conclusion, to fear God and keep his commandments. And so as we consider this section and as we look ahead to what yet's to come, we want to ask, in what ways did even the Roman philosophers fail to fear God? And in what way did that shape the manner in which they failed to keep his commandments? And if we dare, we ought to ask the same question. How do our churches, how do those closest to us struggle in our day, in new settings and analogous ways, to fear God and to follow his commandments as we ought? Consider that, discuss that as you work through books 8 through 10 this month.